Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Trevor White. I am the director of the Little Museum of Dublin, and you are all very welcome to this evening's Santa Rita 120 Dublin Stories. Good evening, Charles. Can you hear me?
Trevor. Oh, yes, I hear you.
You're very welcome.
Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, this evening we are going to discuss one of my favorite subjects in the company of one of my favorite Dubliners. The subject of our conversation this evening is a man called Brendan Bracken, one of the most, arguably one of the most mysterious and remarkable Dubliners of the last century. He is the subject of a highly acclaimed biography by Charles Lysaght, our guest this evening, which you can see there. And I note, Charles, that you have a copy of it behind you as well.
Yes.
I'm pleased to see. This extraordinary book was published in 1979. You can now find it on eBay for £229 if you so desire. It is a book so good that Bill Deeds, the legendary editor of the Daily Telegraph, invited Charles into his office after reading it and proudly announced that it was the first book that he had read from cover to cover for many years. High praise indeed. Charles, you might please start by telling us, or telling our viewers, who was Brendan Bracken?
Well, to summarize, he was Winston Churchill's closest friend in politics. Minister of Information in his wartime government, and he was the only person brought up as an Irish Catholic to have served in the 20th century British government. And he was also influential as a newspaper man. He was founding father of the group that includes the Financial Times and the Economist, which are the only London papers really with a worldwide reach today. So he was a significant figure in British life. But he renounced, I suppose, his Irish background, his religion, and the reaction, I suppose, that evoked in Ireland was well expressed by one man who said it was like having a Jew in Hitler's government. He was, in short, for many years an unmentionable, and there's a degree of rehabilitation, I suppose, by biography and your excellent exhibition, which you had a few years ago, of course, in the Little Museum, when you bought the very moving letters which he had written to his mother, which had survived.
Charles, I'd like to begin by considering Bracken's birth and his childhood. And maybe you'd tell our viewers a little bit about Tipperary and Dublin, and maybe bring us up to Australia.
Yes, he was born in Temple Moor in Tipperary. His father, J.K. Bracken, was one of the founders of the GAA and a Fenian, extreme nationalist. And he died, however, when Brendan was just over 3 years of age. And it was a few years later, Brendan's mother, who was also from Tipperary, from Borrisoleigh, she moved the family to live in Drumconra and then on the North Circular Road. And she had 4 children of the marriage and 2 stepchildren to look after. But they were comfortably off. They weren't that badly off, but still, she was struggling a little. And he was sent to what was then always called Richmond Street, the Christian Brothers, the O'Connell schools. He spent 4 years there. And he was a problem child, really. He was hyperactive, I think, and all kinds of pranks, destroying people's gardens, and supposed he'd be called a juvenile delinquent, really, but that got dropped as he became a famous man, pouring soup into people's letterboxes and so on. And the mother threw a boy into the Royal Canal, and the mother to control him, sent him to a boarding school called Mungret it's closed now in Limerick, a Jesuit boarding school. So he ran away from that school several times. And so the question was what to do. And at 14 years of age, he then took off for Australia. Now, whether she shipped him off or whether it was his own decision to do so, I'm not quite certain. But she had relatives in Australia, a priest in Victoria, and so he went off at 14 years of age across the seas during the First World War to Australia. And he first of all was put up in Catholic religious houses by his cousin. Then he went off wandering himself, and he really self-educated himself by reading, taking odd teaching jobs. And I was only able to discover snapshots, if you like, of his Australian years. At the end, he taught in a Church of Ireland school, Church of England Anglican school in Australia. He seemed to have shed to some degree his background and decided he was no longer a believer or a Catholic. That seems to have happened in Australia. So even that's not clear, because at one stage he gave his name as Brendan Bracken. He was a fan of Cardinal Newman at the time. Anyway, when he was about 19, he returned from Australia, 1919, yes, he would have been 18, and he found that his mother had remarried. She remarried a man called Patrick Laffan. Now, Patrick Laffan was his godfather as well, and he was the father of Patrick Laffan, whom people would be familiar with on the stage in Dublin. That was he was the father of him, not by Brendan's mother, but by his subsequent marriage. So he found that, and there was an almighty family row when he returned about the inheritance of J.K. Bracken, who had left money to be distributed among his 6 children. And I think he took flight and decided this wasn't the place for him and went off to Liverpool.
So Charles, I'm going to stop you there for a moment, because I want to just show our viewers a couple of images just to illustrate this extraordinary adventure that you've just outlined there. And Fiona, I know, who's in the background, has a couple of images. Fiona, you might give us the next slide, please, in our series. I think we have a picture of, so this is a letter that you're looking at here. I don't know whether you can see it, Charles, but I have on the screen, I have a letter from a woman who owns the Mont Eagle Arms in Foynes. And this is a letter sent in 1915 when Brendan is 14 years old, and he decides that he's going to abscond from Mungret, this Jesuit boarding school, and he checks into a series of hotels all over the southwest of Ireland, posing under various names. And this is a letter that is eventually sent to his mother, Hannah Ryan. Dear Madam, yours with cheque for 30 shillings for your son's board and housing here to hand, which at your request I accept in payment of account furnished. She writes, I assure you that I had as much trouble in catering to your son as any other customer, and he took up just as much of my servant's time and space in the hotel as those people paying 10 shillings per day. A rather indignant letter sent to the mother of this already quite eccentric young man who decides to abscond from school. And then, Fiona, we might just go on to the next slide, if we may, just to give viewers a sense of Brendan's appearance as a young man. I think we have a shot of him. There we have it. Yes. So this is a photograph that's actually been colorized, but it's been colorized under your authority, Charles, in relation to the color of the hair, which people said was really very bright red. Was it not? Yeah. So you get a sense of the ebullience of this young man and the confidence of this young man in these images. Charles, I'd like you to take us on now, please, from this arrival in Limerick. Where does he go? He's 19 years old now. He's effectively been banished twice, really, from Ireland at this young age, and he comes to England. And what does he do then?
Yes, I do think banished. I think it was his own decision that he wanted to go to Liverpool. I don't think.
Well, he's made to feel unwelcome, I think is fair to say, is it not?
Possibly, yes. There were, like all family stories, there were conflicting accounts that you had to choose between. But he decided anyway he'd go to Liverpool. He gave a false age and he got a job as a teacher in a school called Liverpool Collegiate College. And he also stayed with people and tutored a son, a place called Freshfield near Liverpool. And wherever he went, of course, he made a great impact. He was a forceful personality and quite aggressive and so on. So he made when he left, the headmaster said he lacked the English stability. So he took himself then to a school called Sedbergh, which is in the Lake District of Yorkshire then. And he turned up and he asked, could he be taken on as a boy in the school? He said he had plans to go to Oxford to read medicine, but would like to prepare himself by coming to this school. So they said, well, who are you and who are your parents? So he said, oh, I'm afraid my parents are dead. They died in a bushfire in Australia and gave me money to complete my education. So here I am to do so. So anyway, his story was believed. It was hard to check in those days. There was no email, or took 6 weeks to get to Australia. So anyway, he was admitted to the school, and he spent only a term in the school, and he won a history prize, and the boys were fascinated by him. He'd given his age as 16 or 15 to get into the school, and he obviously was a bit more. But anyway, after a term, he took his leave. He didn't go to Oxford, but took his leave from the school, and he got several teaching jobs in prep schools in England. And then he got a job with a paper called the Empire Review, a periodical, and that brought him into the world of journalism. And of course, through journalism, he met a famous journalist called J.L. Garvin, who was of Irish family, but he was editor. He was the most famous editor of the Observer newspaper. And he helped him. He was writing a life of Edmund Burke, and he helped him with his library and so on in his home in England. And Churchill, it was there that he met Churchill. Winston Churchill came to lunch there, and they met for the first time. And whatever, he must have impressed Churchill, and that was the beginning of the long political relationship, which
so he's about in his early 20s. Would he have been 21 or 22?
I suppose 1923. He would have been 22 at that stage. And then he organized. Churchill was rather isolated politically just at that time. He was leaving the Liberal Party. He hadn't got back into the Conservative Party. He stood in a by-election in Leicester. And Bracken organized the campaign.
It was unsuccessful, though, I think, was it?
Well, he didn't almost want to get in. It was a safe Labour seat. There was no chance he'd get in. But it was a way, I think, of working his way back into the Conservative Party, which he was keen to do at the time. And that was really the beginning of this. Churchill loved, I think, young men with vitality, and Bracken had tremendous energy. He oozed energy and vitality and go, and Churchill didn't care what a person's background was, that didn't matter to him. If the people, if he liked them, that was wonderful. So anyway, he attached himself to Churchill, and Churchill had moved just to Chartwell. He lived there, and he had a house in London, but Mrs. Churchill, Clementine Churchill, took a less favourable view of this Chancellor, as I suppose that wouldn't be a word she'd have used, but anyway, who mountebank would be the word, and she took a poor view of him. And then a rumour got going that he was Churchill's son. He, according to Lady Churchill, as she was, I met her before while I was reading the book, and she told me that he purloined family photographs from the house and put them up in his own flat in London as if they were his own family. And she thought he was trying to pass himself off as Churchill's son. And the rumour got going that he was Churchill's son. And she taxed her husband with this, and he said he didn't think so, but he'd have to check. So that, of course, didn't improve relations at all.
I want to return to Clementine Churchill, Charles, later in the conversation, because I know she undergoes a conversion of sorts
very
later
much
in life. But I want to just to dwell a little bit on the career in publishing and then his entry into politics, because I suppose a lot of people listening to this story will find themselves thinking, oh, well, this fellow is, as you said, a chancer. He's just a very sort of a garrulous, showy person, a Walter Mitty type person, really. But of course he's not, and in a way that is it not the most? I mean, what's fascinating really about Bracken is that he is this combination. He is certainly a spoofer, as we'd say in Ireland, but he's also a person of great substance, isn't he?
Yes, that is he's a paradoxical kind of figure. That's what makes him so interesting, that he's partly a chancer, partly a most sincere man. He's a tremendous fibber, telling lies about his background and so on, and yet he's a man of absolute probity in his business dealings. And of course, he was a man of great personal loyalty as in his relationship with Churchill. And he was an important figure in, of course, the world of journalism, because of the group of papers he brought together. He was obviously very intelligent, and he could hold his own in any company. He had an immense memory. And stores of knowledge about history and architecture. He was a great connoisseur of architecture and art, and that he brought with him. His appearance was quite remarkable. It fascinated people in England, this tremendous red hair. Of course, Churchill had red hair when he was young, but Bracken's was carrot red, and then he had very white skin. And he had somewhat, his features were I don't know what you call them, but they were such that people thought he was of mixed race. That was one rumor about him, that Churchill had had an affair with a black girl or a colored girl in South Africa. That was the story, and that was the result. He was the result was this man with the red hair. So there was all these stories. Of course, in England, it was extraordinary. They had this idea that if you were anyone of note, you must come from a great family. There was Ramsay MacDonald, who was the Labour Prime Minister. The rumour got going he was the Earl of Dalhousie's son, and even Margaret Thatcher, people would ascribe some illustrious background to her. Inconceivable that anyone without background would be any good, you see.
So I want to take you back, Charles, to the 1920s. He runs, I think, is it in 1928 for the seat in Bournemouth for his own first foray into politics as an MP?
No, in 1929 actually,
29.
just into 29.
Mm.
He runs no, Bournemouth is later. He runs for North Paddington.
Yes.
He had a slight rift with Churchill, in those years. So Churchill played no part in it, and he was adopted as the Conservative Party. And the Conservatives had been in for 4 or 5 years, and they were expected to lose this election to Labour. Mm-hmm. And one of the seats they were expected to lose was North Paddington. Right. It was a marginal seat, and he impressed people as someone who'd win it. He had a great power to impress people. He must have had a very powerful presence and personality. Mm-hmm. And anyway, he was adopted as a candidate, and there was a terrific election campaign, rowdy meetings, and everything. And he passed. He passed his background off. He said he was one of the great old British bulldog breed, and said he'd been at Oxford University, which he hadn't, but he'd been there for a few weeks during the vacation once. So he said he had been at Oxford, and
this man, remember, let's not forget, this is a 28-year-old son of a founder member of the GAA, a prominent Fenian from Tipperary, and here he is wading into Parliament as a Tory MP. And at the same time, he's enjoying great success in publishing, I think, isn't he?
Yeah, he's beginning to accumulate the newspapers. He became a manager for a firm called Eyre and Spottiswoode, and they had begun to collect together this group of financial papers, the Economist, the Banker, the Financial News then at that stage. And that was part of what made him seem a dynamic figure that would be worth adopting and would get into Parliament. But anyway, the rumour got round in Paddington that all this story about his background wasn't true, that in fact he was a Polish Jew. And this story, and to counter this story, his election agent said, you have to get your birth certificate. So he had to get his birth certificate from Temple Moor. And under the birth certificate was put, Bracken is British by birth, of long generations of people who consider themselves British. And that was part of his. So as far as the Paddington electorate were concerned, that was better than being a Polish Jew. Anyway, he was elected. He said he was elected on the votes of the ladies of easy virtue in Maida Vale, and who were the solid base of the Tory party in North Paddington. They were in favour of free enterprise. That was it. So anyway, he gets into Parliament, and he makes quite an impact there. And at that stage, really, he attaches himself to Churchill. And through the 1930s, Churchill was broke with the Conservative Party on India, really, first. And Bracken was very imperialist. He believed in the British Empire, and he agreed with Churchill on that. So that's what really brought them together again in the 30s, resisting any degree of self-government for India. And of course, then the German thing began to get going about 1932 and 1933. Hitler comes to power, and again Churchill breaks. He's not a member. The Conservatives are in government, but he's not a member of the government, so he's in backbencher. And as Bracken said, we were a party of two. And Bracken was his only consistent supporter through these years. And after all, he was then well in his 50s, and it looked as if his political career was ebbing out.
Yeah, this is Churchill, of course. So it's impossible to overstate the kind of the irrelevance of Churchill, really, in the 1930s. He's an also-ran. He's a figure. He's a sort of almost a blimpish sort of figure, isn't he? Who's very isolated, and then we have the 10th of May, we have May 1940, we have the elevation. Maybe you tell us a little bit about that, and particularly about Bracken's role in Churchill's elevation to Prime Minister.
Yes, well, in 1939, of course, war was declared, and Churchill is recalled to the government by Chamberlain, who was the Prime Minister, and he becomes First Lord of the Admiralty. And then the British lose out at the beginning of the war. The Norwegian campaign are kicked out of Norway, and there's a government crisis, and it's clear that Chamberlain won't survive. He had been the apostle of appeasement, and that was held against him. So the question was, who would succeed? And Chamberlain had a meeting about it, and most Conservatives didn't want Churchill. Lord Halifax had been the Foreign Secretary and would have been the favourite within the Conservative Party. And there was a meeting was called, and Bracken got on to Churchill. Churchill felt he couldn't refuse to serve under Halifax if Halifax were nominated. And really the nomination was up to Chamberlain to say to the king who would he call for. So Bracken said to Churchill, say nothing. When Chamberlain puts it to you, who should succeed, say nothing. So in fact, there was what Churchill called the longest silence he had ever known. And after 2 minutes, Halifax said, well, I don't know, he said, in the House of Lords, it might be difficult for me. He was really half-hearted, although people wanted to draft him. And then that meant that Chamberlain had to recommend Churchill, and Labour agreed. Labour weren't prepared to go on under Chamberlain, but they're prepared to serve under Churchill. So that's been called the Great Silence that saved England. And the idea for it came from Brendan Bracken, which was some contribution to history, really.
Absolutely. I mean, you could argue, I mean, if you take that at face value, you could argue that he was instrumental in Churchill's elevation. Of course, Halifax, it would have been unusual for a member of the House of Lords to become Prime Minister, wouldn't it? Because it hadn't happened for, was it 30, 40 years? Yes,
not impossible, though.
Yeah.
Not impossible. And
so Churchill gets in, and then we've the war, a story we're all familiar with, but less familiar perhaps is the role played by this enigmatic Irishman who suddenly finds himself very much at the centre of the British establishment at this pivotal moment, really, in British history. And then he is elevated then to Churchill's wartime cabinet. Could you tell us a little bit about the role that he plays as Minister for Information in that?
Yes, he's not immediately Minister of Information. He's really the kind of Dominic Cumming of the administration at the beginning, the spin doctor and the man behind the scenes. That's really for 1 year is his role after Churchill. He moves in to live in Downing Street, so they have conferences every night, and so he's very close to the center of power. And it was he spoke a lot to the press as a kind of spin doctor for Churchill, and then the press got restless. They didn't like the ministers of information that were there, and Bracken got drafted in as Minister of Information and got the press on side, and he's very good at dealing with the Americans. He knew a lot about America, and he was kept people informed about it, and it was very important to get America into the war.
Is it that when Harry Hopkins comes over, when Roosevelt sends Harry Hopkins over, that Bracken is assigned to sort of chaperone him around?
Well, he meets them. The crucial thing was when he flew into Poole Airport and had that visit, and Bracken is present at the beginning and at various points in that. So that's quite important. And American war correspondents in London were very important.
Right.
Tried to get them into the war, which was crucial, really.
Of course.
And
So he plays this extraordinary role. And then what happens sort of towards the end of the war, he really takes the blame, does he not, for the failure in that election in 1945. And then he is appointed as First Lord of the Admiralty. Is that right? Is it?
No, what happened really at the end of the war, there was a coalition with the Labour Party throughout the war. Labour joined the government, and just at the end of the war in Europe, that coalition government breaks up because Labour decide they want to contest the post-war election on their own. And a caretaker government is formed, and Bracken becomes First Lord of the Admiralty in that government. And he had very right-wing views on economics. He was quite a laissez-faire man. He would have been a Thatcherite before his time. And he felt that the only hope of reviving England was free enterprise, not socialism or the welfare state or anything like that. And he gave one of the broadcasts in the 45 election, but it wasn't the mood of the time.
No.
There was a lot of state intervention in England. They were afraid of a repeat of 1918, when the war heroes were elected to go on and didn't do well. So against all the odds, Churchill, the great war hero, was defeated in the general election. You could say that it showed that the English were going soft, that that a nation that was still great wouldn't defeat its war leader at the end of a war. But it's what they did. They were going for comfort, not greatness. And of course, the Labour government of Attlee came in, and was a very fine government in its way. But many people would say that Britain had gone wrong economically, that what Bracken would have advocated would have kept them stronger economically, but they wouldn't have had the wonderful welfare state.
Indeed.
All that.
So 1945 is a year of political difficulties for him, but professionally in his publishing, it's a very significant year as well, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, his publishing is a group owned by, of course, Al Spottiswoode. He acquires the Financial Times. The paper they had in the 1930s was called the Financial News. It was a smaller paper, and it merged, and they took over the Financial Times. They were able to buy it. And of course, that the greatness of the modern Financial Times dates from that time. They had a very good editor. But the view, Gordon Newton, who was the great editor, said the real founding father of the whole enterprise was Bracken, because it was his vision that fired them. While there were individual people who played important roles, he had this vision of honest journalism, of independent, honest journalism, and high standards of writing, well-researched stuff. And they held to that. He became chairman of he was that until, of course, time he died in the 1950s. But coming back to the war, Trevor, he was very much, of course, he didn't come to Ireland, and he was very much opposed to, critical of the Irish neutrality in the war. He said it made him ashamed to have Irish blood at one stage. But his relationship with Ireland was very interesting, and brought out in the splendid exhibition you held, that the last time he voluntarily came to Ireland was in 1928. His mother died. The extraordinary thing was that he rejected everything in his background except his mother, to whom he seemed totally devoted. But she was a good mother, you could doubt. But but the rest of his family, he really wasn't on good terms with. His brother, he fought with a lot, Peter, and so on. But if they were ever in need, he would come to their rescue. Yes, he was a very good man in that way.
Just about her mother, Charles. I mean, she was obviously a very complicated woman. This woman who described herself as Hannah Ryan Lady on her marriage certificate, a woman who he had, as you say, Brendan clearly adored, but there isn't much evidence that it was reciprocated.
Well, of course, we haven't, as we say, he destroyed all his own papers, so we don't know what he wrote back, but there seemed to be some suggestion that she kept him distant, as Churchill's mother did with him, of course. But she was quite a well-educated lady. I think she would have regarded herself as belonging to a superior social class than her husband. He was a successful man who had been stonemason, but he did good business. He was a builder. But
monumental sculptor, is that what you
monumental sculptor, yes, but I suppose there would have been some difference. It wouldn't have been large, but that might have been why she thought she was necessary to describe herself in that way. But she seemed to read a lot, and we only get a picture of her in the mirror of Bracken's letters to her. His thing, you were born for large and generous surroundings, for the best in every part of life. That was one of his sentences. And she was quite young. There was an awful cancer in the family, and his father had died of cancer in his 50s, and the mother also died of cancer. So they.
I wanted just to staying on the relationship with Churchill for a moment. I'd like you just to reflect on that, Charles, if you would. We know so much about Churchill. This relationship with Bracken, how do you assess it in terms of its significance? How would you describe it?
Yeah, well, I think it was really a very close friendship, I think, and in some way he had an ability to cheer Churchill up, to lift Churchill's spirits. That was his energy and ebullience, I think, did that. And then, of course, he was so totally loyal. That was the key in later years. And he looked after, he was a trustee of the Churchill Trusts eventually, and he looked after all the family. But it caused difficulty with Randolph Churchill, Churchill's only son, because he was very hurt. He felt Bracken was treated almost like his father's son, and he felt frozen out. Now, he was a very difficult personality, but that was part of the family story, the Churchill family story.
It's Randolph, of course, who comes up with arguably the most concise summary of Bracken in this phrase, the fantasist whose dreams came true.
Yes.
It was Randolph, wasn't it?
Yeah, oh yes, a marvelous obituary. Strangely, Randolph wrote a wonderful obituary of Bracken, with whom he had a very up and down relationship. He summed them up very well. That was one of the things, the fantasist whose fantasies came true. More unkindly, he used to call him my brother, the bastard, which was less when he felt poorly about him. But he fought with everyone. He
had good reason to be jealous, of course, of Brendan, because, as you say, his father was extremely close. And they were drinking buddies as well. I mean, to put it bluntly, I mean, is that fair to say that Bracken was one of these people who would be, late at night, he would find himself in Churchill's company, arguing, speeches, debating the direction of the war? Is that the kind of role? Is it
indeed, a great late night. The late night sessions were that's why he lived. If anyone goes to the cabinet rooms, well worth visiting under Downing Street, you'll see Mr. Bracken's room. under the cabinet thing. It's quite moving, really, to see it there. But and Churchill said the three people whose advice and conversations he benefited most in the war were General Smuts, the South African, Lord Beaverbrook, the Canadian, and Brendan Bracken, the Irishman. It's
Amazing.
Who are the three people who he...
and yet Bracken is he doesn't feature hugely in Churchill's history of, 6-volume history of the war. He's a person who almost sort of fades from view, doesn't he?
Yes, well, Churchill didn't, and none of the people who worked closely with them were really mentioned in that. It doesn't give you any insight into what was happening behind the scenes of the direction of the war. A few of the people published their own versions. There was a man who almost succeeded to Bracken's role called Jock Colville. He wrote wonderful, he kept diaries and he published those Fringes of Power. They're very good. And then Lord Allenbroke, one of the Ulster Brooks, he was the military advisor there and was in constant rows with Churchill because Churchill thought he knew all about how to run wars. And Allenbroke was stubborn. He says, Churchill said, oh, those Ulster crowd, they don't come much more stubborn than those. But anyway, Allenbroke wrote memoirs and they caused great offense because he told what was happening behind the scenes. But Bracken really didn't write his own account, so we don't know.
I'd like to just reflect on that, Charles, that that decision that Bracken makes towards the end of his life to fade from view. It's arguable that he makes a decision to sort of write himself out of history, having thrust himself into the very heart of things. And I wonder whether you might just first maybe tell us what happens after the war in terms of those last 13 years of his life, maybe, please, first.
Well, he's in opposition, of course, plays a big part in opposition on the Tory party, largely safeguarding Churchill, really, because some people would like Churchill to have moved on. But he's a major figure opposing nationalisation. They were very sceptical of the National Health Service and all that. And then in 1950, there's an election and Labour get back in 50. And then there's another election in 51. And the Conservatives get back. And Bracken, who now had moved to the constituency of Bournemouth, that was his constituency, he is offered a post by Churchill as colonial secretary. And
it's ironic, really, isn't it?
Yes, run the British Empire. And anyway, he decided he wouldn't take it. He didn't want to, and it surprised Churchill that he said no. I think he had sinusitis. He always had bad health, and perhaps he was bored with politics, or he didn't see himself as a major. That was really his thing. But
and then he sort of sent up to the House of Lords, but he rarely went. Is that right?
Yes, well, usually if you're a man who'd held cabinet posts and you retired, you'd be offered a peerage and to become a member of the House of Lords. And he didn't. I suppose he didn't like to offend Churchill by turning down the peerage, but he wasn't all that pushed about it.
Did he call it the morgue? Was it Bracken?
The morgue, he called Bracken, the House of Lords. So he didn't want to play any further part in active public part in politics, but he was obviously consulted a lot with Churchill. He was behind the scenes still to some degree in the 50s. But there's an air, though, of declining powers about his life, whether it was this sinus trouble or he talks a lot about his health. But at an age when a lot of other people are coming to the peak of their powers, he seemed to have become quite old. He was talking about the past incessantly, and he wasn't the figure he had been in his prime. If you like, his prime came earlier than most.
Right.
He was fading out, really. He died, of course, quite early, 1958, from cancer, but he wasn't going anywhere even before that. It was,
So he's only 57 when he dies. Can you tell us a little bit about the decision to have his papers burned and what a significance you attribute to that?
Yes, I don't. He was quite secretive in a way about things, and I don't know that there's great significance. I suppose he hadn't gone through his, perhaps he hadn't gone through them and he didn't know what was in them. Mm-hmm. It wasn't in his will. He told his butler, he had a butler called Costello, and he told him he was instructed him to destroy the papers, and that's why they were destroyed. But what had he kept? See, some people don't keep a lot, so you just wouldn't know how much was in the papers. But the wonderful thing was he wrote wonderful letters, which I was very lucky to have for my book, and they were in other people's collections. So the fact that he destroyed his papers didn't mean I didn't know a lot about him. But of course, there was always a feeling he was a kind of man of mystery, that he was an extrovert, and the mystery about his background and all that. People thought he was perhaps concealing something by having his papers destroyed. I don't know that that really was true.
Well, on that subject, I note that we have a question. Gabriel, Gerard has a question. Did Bracken ever marry?
No, he didn't. He had several girlfriends, one very attractive lady, Penelope Dudley Ward, in the 1930s. And he used to take her around. And he always liked it to be thought that he wasn't married because he had turned her down. But her mother assured me that he had never asked her. He told everyone else he was in love with her, but he wasn't, he didn't tell her. She became an actress, as she was an actress, and she married Sir Carol Reed, who was a famous, is it The Third Man or some famous film? And her mother was the mistress of the Prince of Wales of the time, King Edward VIII, whom I met when I was reading the book. Her mother, Frida Dudley Ward, she was called. And she was, so he was riding high in a way, but after that he gave up on that, and he was a bachelor, living on his own, the butler and cook. A very good relationship with them, really. With it was a good sign of him that people who worked for him had such a high regard for him.
There was sort of there are question marks about his sexuality as well, though. I think it's fair to say, isn't it? I mean,
yes,
I don't go into it in the book because you've no evidence. It was certainly said, wasn't it, by some of his peers that he was homosexual.
Oh yes, there would have been certainly a feeling that he was that, and but as you say, there wasn't really evidence as such. But it would be true that it seemed to be he had no important relationship of that kind. You know, he hadn't teamed up with anyone,
right?
And so that wouldn't. It's a difficult thing, really, to discuss that much without much evidence, and that was certainly absent from it. But it might well have been so. He had wonderful taste in things like architecture and art, which people often associate with people who are gay, I suppose. And also in those days, well, I don't think it was responsible for his decision not to live in Ireland, but Irish people who were of that persuasion, if you like, often moved away. But that would be sort of when they were living a practicing gay life, which there isn't really evidence of that in his life. And he obviously
A couple of other questions, Charles. Chris Cassidy asks, was he ever a member of the Privy Council? I think the answer it's yes, isn't it? But to the disgust of the king, is that right? Or to the disappointment of the king, was he made a member of the Privy Council?
Yes, when he became when Churchill became Prime Minister, he nominated him to the Privy Council because he was party to so many secrets, and there was some objection from the king. I think it was really from the courtiers of the king rather than the king himself. See, most Privy Councillors would have held a post as a minister or something, and he was being made a Privy Councillor at quite a young age without holding any ministerial post. And Churchill more or less said, well, he would have had him as a minister anyway, and so he talked down the objection.
Redmond MacDonald asks, given Churchill's continued unpopularity in Ireland, is Bracken destined to remain an unclaimed son of Ireland?
Well, I suppose he was until Queen Elizabeth's visit here, and when at Croke Park, the president of the GAA mentioned the fact that the Queen was visiting Croke Park, and the GAA had been founded by the father of one of her ministers, and I suppose she had met Brendan Bracken.
Really?
Because she was at whether she remembered it or not, when she dined, a very unusual thing, she dined at Churchill's house the day before he retired as Prime Minister.
Right.
And so she would have put us up whether she remembered it or not. But that was, if you like, a certain rehabilitation of Brendan Bracken in the Irish lexicon.
Yeah. He is still well known. Again, another question John Wilson asks, is Bracken well known within the Conservative Party today?
No, this is the irony of everything, really, that he's a footnote to history in a way in England. He comes up because of the Churchill connection and the press, and there's a kind of inner circle who know his name. But the strange thing about him is he's more remembered in Ireland, the country he wants to shed, because in a way he's an example of an Irishman who wants to shed his background, wants to make himself British. And that's a theme of life that wouldn't be peculiar to Brendan Bracken.
Indeed.
The Irish who wanted to integrate in English life. So in a strange way, he's the epitome of that, and his life, the interest in him survives in Ireland. But of course, very much stimulated by your exhibition, I have to say. That was the most wonderful exhibition that you brought about of, and it was so well presented in the little museum. It was wonderfully presented, made so interesting.
Well, it was a privilege to work with you on it, Charles.
You
did all the hard work, really, in curating it, but it was
no, your team was terrific, and you even painted it. Pity there was no colour photography, that we don't know how red the hair was.
Well,
you had a good shot at it, but we don't know. Someone said the reddest hair they'd ever seen.
Indeed.
Yeah.
I wonder, just sort of moving towards the end of this conversation, Charles, how you would assess the Bracken legacy, and really, I suppose, crucially, how you think he deserves to be remembered, if at all.
Oh, his contribution to the wartime victory is immense. His role bringing this group of newspapers is immense, really. But in some ways, his great interest is as a personality. They said even war modeled Rex Mottram on him. But in a way, the most interesting thing is this complex personality, essentially positive. You know, for all the phoniness, as someone said, everything about you is phony, even your hair looks like a wig. But for all that phoniness, he was a man who did the right thing and looked after people in need. And he was a good man, I think. even if he, of course, renounced all religion.
Yeah.
It was very serious when he died. It was considered a terrible thing that he had died without a priest. Numerous priests were trying to get him to see him.
He was quite rude, I think. He said, "Spare me the black shirts of God."
Yeah, the black shirts of God are after me.
Yes.
But he was brave.
Indeed. I just want to return to Clementine Churchill and really just to ask you to reflect finally, Charles, just on the writing of the book and the people that you met. I mean, I read an extraordinary essay that you is unpublished as yet, but I'd love to see it published, I must say, about your experience of writing the book and indeed of speaking to many contemporaries of Bracken. But I'd like you to tell us a little bit about that experience of going to see Clementine Churchill and talking to her about her reminiscences and really the journey that she sort of undergoes in terms of her views and how they change.
Yes, it was very interesting. She was very old at the time, of course. She was still very beautiful, but she was very bitter. She looked quite bitter talking about the way he behaved as a young man. And then, you know, how good he'd been afterwards. And she said she was embarrassed. She said, I remember she said he became ever so respectable, he said. That was her phrase. And she was embarrassed that her husband had taken him so much for granted, that he had allowed him to do so much for him, and in a way hadn't reciprocated. But it was a strange mixture of bitterness of his early behavior and then feeling he'd been very good. But she really was an orthodox English upper class woman, and he would have been a kind of colonial, brash colonial. So he wasn't the kind of person who appealed to her, but yet he'd been so good. She felt a regard for him. She bought him flowers when he was dying. That was the great thing.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's very touching.
Yeah.
And there's an incident that she's still very sore about many years later about he was supposed to take Randolph to the zoo and he never turned up.
That's right, yes. I told it, yes, she told me that.
And whatever, 40 years later, she's still a bit sore about that. But at the same time, she also regrets that Winston had sort of taken him for granted, I think.
That's
really,
it, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, but she felt she said she felt he took her husband. He and Lord Beaverbrook took her husband away from her.
Oh,
there was that feeling about it. So she was conflicted because I suppose she was so old. She was rather unguarded in the way she spoke to me. Certainly things were said in that conversation which I've never seen in any other book about her.
Charles, it has been such a pleasure to speak with you this evening. I know we've had a huge number of comments from people watching this conversation, and I'm sorry we didn't get to all of the questions that people have asked, but I do hope that we have given you a flavor of the extraordinary, complex, contradictory, but ultimately quite inspiring life of this figure who is, as Charles says, this very paradoxical person, one of the most mysterious Irishmen, really, of the 20th century, but a man who I think deserves to be remembered. And I think on that note, we all owe a huge debt of gratitude to you, Charles, for your extraordinary work in bringing him to life in this remarkable book, which I highly recommend to you. If you cannot get your hands on it, ladies and gentlemen, you can buy, here comes the plug, you can buy a booklet, which I see behind you, Charles, there, which is Churchill and the Irishman.
You want me to show it?
Well, please do. Why not? Why not? Which we produced in a limited edition with the assistance of the Financial Times, it must be said, when we produced this exhibition in the Little Museum. And I, as I said, had the privilege of working with Charles.
That's a great photograph.
Indeed, it is a great photo. But for now, you can buy that on our website, incidentally, on littlemuseum.ie on our shop. But for now, Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. And crucially, Charles, thank you very much for joining us. It's been such a pleasure talking with you this evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Trevor.